happening on the lands of the Wurundjeri Woiwurrung people of the Kulin Nation, and I'd like to extend my respects to all the Indigenous people here today. What we're going to be doing now is you're going to be watching a demo debate between some of the best WGM speakers that were willing to do the debate, which we're very excited about. And then we're going to have a brief equity briefing, and then we'll do the WGM forum. I'm really excited about the lineup of speakers for today. On the affirmative team, we have Amanda Ching, Eleanor Douglas, and Charlie Ryan. And on the negative team, we have Alexis, Mcharo, Zhang, and Ellie. The speaking times will be 6 minutes. I'll introduce everyone briefly before their speech. The motion for today's debate is that apoliticality is immoral. The first affirmative speaker, Amanda, is an AWGM DC Grand Finalist and has broken at Easters, and importantly is from Melbourne, which we're very excited about. All right, first affirmative, Amanda. There's here. Yeah, Rob is filming.
Yeah, you're over.
To be apolitical is immoral when social media and the rise of technology has made it so that making a social media post quite literally only takes a few minutes, when taking a few hours out of your year to go and protest and help canvas does not materially affect you in any way, when raising awareness and telling your friends about the latest political issue literally only takes a few seconds, being apolitical is deeply immoral. 3 things in the speech: firstly, setup, and then 2 arguments. First, setup. What do we define political engagement as? We would note that political engagement is incredibly low bar, and it is something that obviously depends on your context. For example, we will not expect a working class mother to go out and protest actively every single day, but we would say that you can do things like raising awareness, as I said in my introduction. Secondly, what would be defined as apoliticality? We would note that being apolitical is a higher bar than being political, noting that being apolitical means that you have to actively disengage with social media, actively choose not to listen to your friends who are going out to the latest protest. We would say that's higher bar. Thirdly, we would note that being immoral, that immorality can be permissible. For example, killing someone is immoral, but we would not say that killing someone in self-defense is immoral. Similarly, we would not say that a judge or someone working in the Department of Education is being deeply immoral by exercising political neutrality in their everyday job. But we say outside of it, if they don't engage in political action, it's quite bad. And fourthly, we would just say that we would know that immorality does not necessarily have to constitute lead to significantly high major consequences. I will of course explain in my speech why that's the case, but we know that this is a scale. Okay then. First argument, why is it incredibly easy to be politically active? And I would note that this argument is incredibly important because it explains to you why the bar for political engagement is quite low. I have several evidences. Firstly, you can just do things like go out and vote. That literally does not take any time out of your day. Secondly, you can do things like, for example, just engaging in active acts of kindness with people around you, especially people like racial or gender minorities. That sort of thing we would say is incredibly important. And we would just like to note here that this negative team might comment and tell you, well, it's not immoral to not choose to actively do a good thing. But note importantly, thirdly, that choosing not to engage in these quite low bar and good actions, it does show and demonstrate where your loyalties lie. For example, actively choosing not to be kind to someone signals to them that you don't take them seriously, that you don't view them as an important figure in your community, which we would say is quite harmful. I would say that fourthly, doing things like just engaging in protests or even small level donations, those all constitute political engagement, and those are incredibly easy. Why therefore is not doing this good thing is not not doing this quite immoral? The first thing I would just say here is that this makes you complicit in the sort of crimes that are, like bad things that are happening. So for example, if I see someone who's like struggling on the street, it is bad of me to not help them, even if, helping them could lead to something worse. Or, for example, if I see a child drowning, me not saving that child is also bad, even if me, even if me potentially shooting that child would also lead to a worse outcome. Here is that, it's an expression of your priorities. Not choosing to engage in politics signals to those around you that you just don't care about politics, that this isn't something that you prioritize. What is it impacting and weighing this argument then? Firstly, as I've already explained, this just explains to you why this is incredibly low burden. So anything you hear from the negative team about why being active politically is incredibly high burden should be discounted. Secondly, this is an argument that even though it's incredibly simple and intuitive, it's an argument that's very easily able to be proved in a very high degree, right? Because it's just that easy to do good things in your everyday life. And I think what are the outcomes of this? I think that firstly, in terms of making yourself better, I would note that firstly, you being politically involved just leads to you making more educated decisions. You learn from the people around you, you learn from them, and you are therefore able to educate those around you. Whereas the Congress is on their side of the house, you mock people who bring up politics. You think you're like a really edgy, cool person who's like, oh god, politics. I don't care about politics. Like that doesn't matter at all. I would also note that secondly, this is a process, right? Like the more you become politically involved, the more you can at least do some small level good in your society. Conversely, on their side of the house, locking yourself out of that is just a huge net negative to the world. Now, moving on to my second argument, why is being apolitical an incredibly illegitimate form of political expression? There's a few mechanisms here. I would note that, firstly, there is a high level of pressure, as I've noted in my introduction, from those around you to be politically engaged, especially if you're born in this generation, especially if you are like the average person who goes to at least high school or at least college. We would say that that level of pressure from those around you to at least say something means that you should do this. Secondly, we would say that being apolitical constitutes a sign of privilege in a few ways. Firstly, note that things like historical discrimination and historical laws have made it so that current laws and current systems and institutions are quite unstructured and horrible to the people on the ground. For example, laws that lead to political segregation, laws that make it so that women and gender minorities and other racial groups might not be paid or promoted or viewed very highly in the workplace. Actively choosing to not engage in politics and separating yourself from that makes it so that you are complicit in those things because as a woman or gender minority, it is just incredibly difficult for you to not be political, because this negative team might come up and tell you that, well, some people might choose to be apolitical to preserve themselves. But if you belong to that class, I think even just speaking out and making a social media post about this does constitute being politically motivated, and that's why those people should engage in that more. In terms of just impacting and weighing this argument, we would just say that firstly, it's just incredibly important to not lead to an increase in political apathy, especially noting in the status quo right now, there are a lot of big, powerful media forces that are trying to garner that. But secondly, we would say that engaging in political apathy leads to a decrease in momentum of political movements that otherwise would remain incredibly powerful. For all these reasons, I'm incredibly proud to propose.
And not common story during speeches. The first negative speaker, Alexis, is I think one of the hardest working members of Australian debating, and someone who we have I think a lot of depth and need to thank. Alexis is a WGM Grand Final judge, quarterfinalist, and a Cambridge WGM champion. Welcome, first negative.
Most people do not live in contexts where freedom of speech or organization are celebrated. Maybe being political is good. That does not make it an obligation. Protesting in many countries can just result in your mother having to identify you in the morgue because the police will shoot at you and kill you. And even in countries like America, students being political have resulted in ICE kidnapping them and holding them in detention quite arbitrarily against the Constitution. And so they had to defend politicality even in the circumstances where it was so high risk. They missed their burden in this debate. Two paths here. First, apoliticality is permissible. Secondly, apoliticality is virtuous. So apoliticality is permissible for things here. First, we think they just have an insanely high burden to meet. We think that they just politicality exists in a spectrum, and there are just many instances where it is impossible for you to be political about an issue because you don't have sufficient exposure to that information. So they also have to prove a moral obligation for you to just find out about every single thing that's happening in the world, form stances about them, and participate politically about them. Not simply make social media posts about things you happen to be concerned about. We think every single person is to an extent apolitical and political. They had to show that apoliticality about all issues was immoral. Secondly, we just think that politics is chaotic by the very mechanisms that they use, where it is incredibly accessible and easy for people to post about politics on their social media feed and things like that. That has resulted in the sources of information, the sources where people look for information in, being polluted by things that are not useful towards them forming a good opinion. That looks like going on X and finding a lot of Nazi content that is just not going to help you in terms of forming a rational stance in the world. And all that also looks like the degradation of media companies in terms of the quality of information that they reported because of the current media landscape and the short attention span that people have in the status quo, as well as just kind of administrations like the Trump administration encroaching on the rights of the media to report certain things. That necessarily means that the sources of information that people have is incredibly poor, but beyond that, politics is ever-changing. A political opinion that you have right now could change with information you could later access in the next week. Therefore, it becomes unclear why you have the burden to be political in this ever-changing information, where the sources of information you have could highly result in you making the wrong decision. We prefer people to be apolitical in those contexts. We believe that it is permissible. Thirdly, we think that apoliticality is often just self-defense as flagged in my introduction, because it's just minimal ability for you to change the status quo in many places. You do not have the violence that the state has access to, and in many instances they use that violence to encroach and to retaliate against people who express political opinions that they made from what they prefer. In those instances, many people do decide to be apolitical, and we support them because it's not just necessary for their own self-defense, but for the protection of their families. In many instances, states use your own friends and family as leverage against you when you transgress against them. They punish them as well as you. We believe you have an obligation to those people as far as the direct action you make. But you have results in direct consequences for their lives, whereas on social media posts, it's unclear what benefit it had, what change it had. We prefer that you protect yourself and your family. Of course, if you choose not to, sure, but we think that it's entirely permissible for you to make that moral calculus. Fourthly, we just think that there are often no moral political options to support, because, people will say you should just pick the lesser of two evils in most election cycles, but we believe that that's a short-term calculus that doesn't actually take into account that, broad evils of, that both parties in that system perpetuate. For example, in my country, I had to choose between two people who were tried by the ICC for crimes against humanity, and so I believe how participating in that system actually results in moral outcomes. And we think that if people actually, apoliticality is a way to express apathy, express a political opinion of your own, that you just think that this is immoral, this is not a system that you want to be a part of, and as a consequence, we believe that that is something that should be available to people. They should have the option to be apolitical, they should have the option to be apathetic. Of course, it is worthwhile to be apathetic in issues, in situations where both options are quite evil, and that is often. Lastly, in terms of why apoliticality is virtuous. First, we just think it's quite humble. It just means that you understand that you do not have access to a lot of the information that is needed to make a good political opinion right now. People who are apolitical often just are more informed than people who are political, in the sense that they are more likely to be curious about, why things are the way they are. They're more likely to question their base assumptions about the world and are actively reflective on the opinions that they hold. That necessarily means that it's actively a good trait to have, as far as it makes you less likely to double down on opinions that you had that were probably indoctrinated into you by your parents and your family and other people around you. We think that it's virtuous in that sense. Secondly, we think that apoliticality is something that results in you being able to engage in better actions for society. For example, maybe you have more time to donate now, maybe you have more time to do things that would directly benefit someone as opposed to trying to change the broad structures of society, because we think that politicality is just something that is quite draining a lot of the time. It does require you building communities and attending protests and spreading the word about certain things, something that is quite high cost and with very speculative impact, compared to you just volunteering at the local shelter at your community. That might exactly why that is significantly worse, why that does not actively result in a benefit towards the community. Lastly, we just think that apoliticality is necessary in many contexts. For example, it is a civic virtue. We need our civil servants to actively be apolitical so that they can serve the people, so they can actually help us so they can serve the people. So for all of those reasons, never been proud to oppose the end.
Thank you, Alexis, for that speech. The second affirmative speaker in this debate is Eleanor Douglas, the first of two Eleanors in this debate. Eleanor has broken our worlds both as a judge and as a speaker, and most importantly, she's my all-time favorite USU IB officer. Welcome, Eleanor Douglas.
Alexis tells you that around the world, governments are often horrible, and in the face of that, it is fine to be apolitical in the choice of two bad options. The problem is, for most people living in these countries where governments are bad, even apolitical decisions are worse for a large amount of the population. If you're refusing to vote for a Labour Party or a slightly left-wing party in your country, you're often dooming women or people who are victims of governments like the Trump government or even liberal government to environments where they are much more unsafe or face much more harm. Even if you are not wanting to do something like protest in Palestine, protests at your universities, the decision of universities to be apolitical in the face of administration's decision to try to kick them out is often the reason that these students are facing the most amount of harm. Even when it is hard, it is far more important for people to be apolitical. The first thing I'm going to talk about is whether or not I think it is permissible, and secondly, I'm going to talk about why most people are better off by trying to engage in being political in some aspect. Firstly, on permissibility. First, negative tells you that we need to defend a high burden of permissibility because it is often harmful. I just want to, firstly, I don't think this is the average person's understanding of what being political is. I don't think we have to defend, for example, someone often going out to protest. A lot of people in Australia just vote, and voting is a political decision that puts someone in party that otherwise wouldn't be. So I don't think we have to defend people often always being dangerous. But secondly, as I pointed out in my intro, I think it is important, I think even if other people are doing dangerous things, you can support other people who are engaging in dangerous things in less dangerous ways. For example, you can even offer emotional support to a friend who is doing this political activity, or offer support in communities around you, or do financial donations that are discreetly. I don't think most people have to put themselves in danger to vote or do those things. But thirdly, as I pointed out in my intro, I think it's fine to have a norm that pushes people to engage in things that are otherwise somewhat at risk to themselves in ways that they can tolerate. Oftentimes, large, powerful institutions or people that have relative degrees of privilege in society, as Amanda tells you, not using their money or their privilege to provide support are the reasons these people are most at risk. The reason universities like Columbia not putting themselves at risk or financial risk to protect students that are getting deported are the reason these students are at harm. It is much better to defend a norm that pushes them to remove themselves from the apoliticality of not defending themselves against the institution. Secondly then, whether or not people being apolitical generally leads to better outcomes. Alexis tells you that sometimes when people are apolitical, it means they'll make and decide to get more information misinformation. It means they'll make the wrong decisions about something. The first thing I'm going to try to explain to you is flip this and explain why when people try to become less apolitical, it leads to better outcomes. I just think, firstly, if you're pushed to read more about a certain topic or read more about the world, or have a political stance, you generally just have some understanding of more things than before. Even if you maybe don't have the perfect opinions, if you're pushed to make some political stances, you're more likely to talk to people in your community, to read news around the world, which at least allows you to have some opinions that are better than having nothing. But secondly, I think it means you come more into conflict with other people, which pushes you to change your opinions in ways that are beneficial for you. If instead of when politics comes up in a friend group, you're like, nah, I don't want to talk about that, I'm not political, it doesn't interest me, you're pushed to hear other opinions or around you that allow you to hear other sides or change your opinions in other ways. But thirdly, I think when people are primed to think that politics or engaging in politics is something that's worthy of them or something they should be forced to do, it's much easier for people who are trying to advocate for certain positions to push them to do things like vote or push them to donate. For example, if you're just someone who's around and listening to people protesting for something or wanting to get you to vote for something, and you're like, I don't really engage in politics, it's not my thing, rather than something that should be an expectation of you, you're far more likely to hear them out. Lastly, I want to explain why I think that even if people create some wrong opinions sometimes, I think this is generally okay. Because I think we actually have a large degree of lack of understanding about what political issues are always the best ones. For example, there's still a lot of debate about what economic policies are best in different times. If at least people are pushed to learn more about it and test something out, or maybe make the wrong decisions at a certain time, I think this is still at least far better than trying nothing at all or not engaging in it, because you're not pushing for any change or any betterment of people's situations. But secondly, as I've already explained, I think since you just come into contact with more ideas and more people, I think it means on large, even if some people get radicalized into worse decisions, on net, most people are engaging more positively in the community around them, which leads directly to the betterment of most people's lives, leads to testing of new ideas, which pushes for the advancement of society. Third thing that Alexis says then is that it's better for people to have some epistemic humility about things that they don't know. But I don't think we tell you that people need to go out, read the economists from cover to cover all the time and learn everything about everything. If people have different understandings and different levels of political understanding about things, but I still think that makes them political. But secondly, I still think when you are a political person, it means you often have more epistemic humility about certain things. And when you know more about a certain subject, you're more able to step back and take an understanding that you don't understand that much about something in comparison. I think you actually get much more arrogant people when they are apolitical and think they can divorce themselves in politics when they otherwise couldn't. The fourth claim that Alexis makes then is that it is often an important social norm to put on some institutions. For example, on epistemic humility, I also just don't think this is most people that are saying that are apolitical. Come on, most people who are saying they're apolitical are just people who are often very wealthy or people who otherwise don't know that much and are being a bit arrogant about it. I don't think most people are that humble. But fourthly, whether or not I think this is a good norm to push on people like judges or public servants, I think it is a political decision often, for example, for the legal decision and judges to take a step back and say they're not going to be judicial activists. It's upholding the political system of a country. But secondly, I think even if, I think that it's better to have some transparency about the fact that maybe politics is something that influences your decisions. And if you're a judge, you can be more cognizant of it, or people can look out for it in changing the political system for the betterment. If, for example, they're trying to push, you to have your own personal politics removed. I also think that personal politics and maybe work politics can be distinct. Very proud to affirm.
Thank you so much, Eleanor, for that speech. The second negative speaker is Isaac. When I asked Isaac what they wanted me to say about them, they said they, quote, have broken at lots of majors and done a lot of traveling, which seems to be kind of the goal. I'd also like to say thank you to Isaac for missing a lot of their prep time to run ADC pre-council. Welcome, Isaac.
very bad.
Bad face? Immorality must be morally absolute. Cold-blooded murder is always absolutely immoral. It is not sometimes immoral. If you use the intuition and extend the logic to this side affirmative, cold-blooded murder is not sometimes immoral, sometimes virtuous, sometimes morally permissible. I'm going to make 3 key arguments. And that argument is essentially that if something is immoral, you are compelled to act against that. But the problem is, politicality and the compellment of political action fails the requirements of moral obligations in 3 ways. Firstly, it fails to be absolutely instrumental. If we use Singer's thought experiment about drowning Mcharo, you have no obligation to call a surf guard. You have no obligation to call an ambulance. The moral obligation on you as an agent in that context is to jump into the pool or the fountain or whatever and save the child. And even if it is at the cost of your own agency, even if at the cost of your nice suit, which is the thought experiment, or even if you're surrounded by strangers who could otherwise do that, the moral obligation still requires and adheres to that set of actions. The problem is, this is not applied to political action. Moral obligation does not incur the maximally efficient, the maximally direct, and the maximally certain outcomes which this side affirmative requires. This has 3 impacts. Number 1, this obviously increases the affirmative burden to prove that moral obligation occurs in instances of apoliticality. That is to say, you must be political in most, if not all, instances in which individuals are harmed. Obviously, we fail that in many, many contexts in the status quo. Second, there is a sort of circumstantial and normative context where this is simply not feasible, or the capacity or the methodology in which you engage in that practice fundamentally fails you. That is to say, in those instances where you oblige or engage in political action, if that political action actively harms you, actively harms your movement and your material interests, that is not something that is morally obligatory for you to do, and therefore not immoral for you to be apolitical. Right. So the final thing is, if they want to cherry-pick certain circumstances, i.e., billionaires who use the logic or the argument that I don't know that much about this issue, so I'm not going to comment on it, or it's difficult for me, so I'm not going to make a social media post. That moral prescription becomes so arbitrary and so generalized that it fails to become a prescription of amorality in the first instance. That is to say, if you cannot generalize a moral statement to all instances in which it is applied, i.e. cold-blooded murder is always and will absolutely be immoral, then that claim is not a useful moral prescription. Like if you say something is sometimes okay and sometimes not okay, then obviously that function as a moral statement is not something that is particularly useful. Obviously that undermines the utility of their argument. The final, impact of this is that often it is always an alternative set of actions which is more effective than political engagement or political redress. Which is to say that for the vast majority of people who live in states of material oppression, it is for those individuals that simply subscribing to the state of capital and working for rent or subsistence is a far preferable outcome and mechanism of engaging in political recourse or improving their material conditions than doing things like campaigning, doing things like voting, doing things like unionizing or collectivizing, because those are the set of actions which literally damn them to the absolute harms which they're trying to prevent on their side of the house. So those are the impacts which explain why that set of claims doesn't make sense. The second reason for why this doesn't work is because apoliticality is sometimes, in certain instances, morally obligatory. X cannot be an amoral function or act if there are certain circumstances where you are compelled to do that thing. And for that simple example that Alexis explains at first affirmative, that in those instances, it is through claiming or through arguing or through ignorance that you're able to save yourself or improve your material conditions or the political conditions of your group or your society, then that is something that is a moral obligation or something that you ought to do. But if that is the case, then it simply makes logical correlation or logical sense that their claim doesn't work. The third, impact of this, or the explanation for this, is that if apoliticality is immoral, it implies that you have to be maximally political. That is to say, you have to always be against cold-blooded murder, and you should always do everything you're possible to do things that do not, end up in that instance of cold-blooded murder, or in the other instance, you must do everything in your capacity and your action in that thought experiment to save that drowning child. The problem is that this obviously isn't possible, because one, morality and the capacity to engage in political action is entirely normative. Some people might say you must commit eco-terrorism against the biggest polluters in the world because that damns billions of people to inescapable climate change. Some people might say that it's okay to shut off the tap. Obviously, in that instance, you cannot cohere the capacity in which it must be morally absolutist or morally maximal, which means that the capacity on their side of the house to actually engage in this action does not fundamentally occur, even if you were charitable to their definition of engaging in political action. So, after this, I'm going to do responses. Obviously, this is the inverted response structure. I'm usually the first speaker, so cool. Eleanor is correct in the claim that it would be morally bad for a billionaire or for a person of high status to use the claim of ignorance to obfuscate their capacity to engage in political action. But just because something is morally bad does not mean that something is morally, something is immoral. That is to say, just because a billionaire should give more, and just because we should all give more, does not mean that one act is necessarily immoral and one other action in the countervailing context is moral or morally necessary. I shouldn't donate $100,000 because I don't have that money. It would make me very, very poor and unable to do the things that I need to do to live. But the billionaire should. But in neither of those contexts are those actions morally obligatory. So just because something is bad does not make it immoral.
Charlie Ryan. When I opened my notes up to see what I'd written about Charlie, it just said mention all the Australs finals. So Charlie has won Australs twice. They've been in Australs Grand Finals 3 times. They're also a World's Grand Finalist. And importantly, they convened a WGM DC in 2023, which is a massive service to our community. I'm really excited about the third speaker exchange in this debate. So welcome to Charlie Ryan.
Two things. Firstly, is being apolitical permissible? And then secondly, is it virtuous or is it in many ways pernicious, as we explained? The first part of this speech is going to be the greater chunk of the speech. I'm going to go through each of their claims and then reinforce what I think has gotten lost, which is the material our first speaker gave you, which I think concretely wins this. They try and prove that it's permissible in a few ways. The first way they try and prove it is by saying that being apolitical for some, or in some ways of framing it, many people, is necessary for their safety. We observe here a very correct intuition about morality, which is that things can be immoral, but permissible because of greater needs in specific instances. And we give some intuitive examples of this. Murder, for example, or the action of taking a life, we would say in general is an immoral action, but it's permissible in the case of self-defense. And that's exactly how they frame their argument, that for some people, apoliticality is a form of self-defense. We'd also give other lower stakes examples. For example, we'd say it is in general immoral to be selfish. However, it is okay for certain people who are particularly vulnerable to be selfish because it serves some greater need and is, in a way, self-defense. The response that we get from second negative is to say that, well, actually murder is not always immoral. It's just specifically cold-blooded murder that is immoral, and that's immoral maximally in every instance, and that's the burden required to describe something as immoral. I think the problem with this is saying the phrase cold-blooded murder is context plus action, right? So we're describing that specific context of murder, or the action of taking a life, in the context where it is not self-defense. And our claim about immorality is indeed generalizable and maximal. That is to say, we believe the action of taking a life is an immoral one, because in every instance and at every time, you should avoid taking a life unless there is some greater circumstance in which prevents you from avoiding doing that, or which otherwise compels you to do that. And that is a maximally true statement. And that's precisely the statement that we're making here. It's that apoliticality is immoral, because in virtually every instance, you should avoid taking that stance and prefer the stance that is more moral, that protects people, that saves people's lives, and that avoids extreme harm, unless there is some greater circumstance that prevents you from doing so. And I would say that it's precisely the same framing, or precisely the same reasoning, that makes the action of taking a life immoral. So no, I don't think it's true that exclusively the context of cold-blooded murder is the thing that is immoral. I think taking a life is immoral, that action can be described as immoral, and therefore because it is immoral, we should avoid it in circumstances where there isn't some greater need. And they give you plenty of examples of what that greater need might look like, but that does not refute the claim that in general, the action of apoliticality is an immoral one. And I would note here as well, as an additional useful bit of framing, that unlike what they say, where they say, well, to be not apolitical requires having a thought of literally everything, that's obviously bullshit, right? Like, what we're talking about here is a person who is apolitical. And what that means is not being apolitical on all those many different things. It is very simple for a person to be political, right? It means simple things like encouraging your kids to have empathy for poor or marginalized people, to have considerations for at least some thought over which political party in general is better, even if both are bad. And the reason why you should understand that intuition is true is that I think it's kind of ridiculous, right, to assume that being apolitical, as it is linguistically and commonly understood, means, having some tiny bits of apolitical thoughts, right? For example, I don't have any clue what's going on in Croatia right now. I have no thoughts on that set of politics, or name a different country in the world, a lot of them. I have no clue what's going on there. But that does not make me an apolitical person, because I have many political beliefs in my context and in my surroundings. You do not need very much to cease to be an apolitical person, and I think you should in general avoid that specific characteristic, which is apathy towards every issue, many of which, as we're saying, but even if you believe there's only a few, have very moral consequences about being apathetic towards. What other ways do they try and say that it's permissible? The next is that it's really hard to be political because there's so much misinformation out there nowadays. I have two responses to this. The first is, I think being tricked by a lot of that misinformation relies on underlying immoral traits. That mean that if you're so concerned about misinformation for a lot of these issues that we talk about, that they pose, rely on things like racism or an underlying belief that people who are different from you must necessarily be a threat. Or, for example, rhetoric around poor people and whether they deserve welfare relies on a profoundly unempathetic view of others. And therefore, to believe that this misinformation is posing an existential threat to your ability to be political, such that you ought not be political about anything at all, I think is profoundly ridiculous. Next, and second to that, I also think that in these days, it's also not hard to gain a level of media literacy. So even if you think it's true that there's a lot of misinformation out there, I think it's perfectly acceptable to say that you should endeavor to be political, and even if the first step of that is spending a very long time figuring out how to sort misinformation from information before you even begin to look at what that information says, I think that's an acceptable way for us to do this debate. Finally, they say that there's no political positions to take in many cases that are moral. I think the problem with this is it assumes that there's a dichotomy between the powers that be in your country. As I'll remind everyone now at this time, you don't have to pick one of the major parties. You don't have to pick any party at all. It's a political expression to say our government is shit and we should strive to fix things in other ways. That's a perfectly moral form of political expression that I would say in many contexts is the one you're morally obliged to have. What's the argument we present? We say that apoliticality is the failure to do a very easy moral thing, to help others, to have empathy, to teach your kids empathy. It doesn't need to be protesting, it just means having care and consideration for others in the way that we ought to fix our world. We weigh this in two ways, and the first one has not been forgotten. The first one is that it's failure to do a good thing. That's very clear. I think I've just defended that principle. But the second that has been forgotten, and I think wins this debate in a way that's been entirely unresponded to, is that apoliticality is an immoral value judgment. Because for the vast majority of people who choose to be apolitical, they are making a value judgment about themselves, which is my time, my peace, is more important than other people's real existential threats to their lives. The fact that I can't be bothered to figure out misinformation from information means it's okay for me not to be empathetic towards trans people. I would say that for privileged people, that is immoral or a poor value judgment on two grounds. Number one, it treats those people as less than yourself. But secondly, it reinforces the axis of privilege that enabled you to be apolitical in the first place. Because what it says is, the privilege that means my peace is something I can protect should remain, rather than me potentially taking social risks in order to protect others. They make a second argument about it being virtuous. I forgot the time of this speech is shorter. They say it's humble. This is just not the reality of how most people are apolitical, right? Ask yourself, like, are apolitical people out there being like, I'm going to be humble and curious today? No. They're saying, I don't care and I can't be bothered. And we say that is an immoral thing. We're very proud to affirm that.
And I'm glad the speaking time is loose. The negative speaker in this debate is Ellie Stephenson, the second Eleanor debate. Ellie has a lot of achievements. They have been a multi-time world semi-finalist. They've been an Australs grand finalist. They've been on the adjudication court of everything, including worlds. They've also won a WGM with the overall best speaker and with a top team. and they're going to rebut Charlie.
So my voice sounds dreadful. My apologies. Think about the people you might know who would actually describe themselves as being apolitical. It might be your grandma or your coworker. They're not a political theorist, they're not an activist, they're probably a swing voter. Maybe they've never been to a protest and they read the news with a faint sense of bafflement and depression. They're often a very clearly moral person. They sponsor a child, they volunteer at St. Vinny's, they're interpersonally kind and tolerant. Think now of the people you know who are the most actively political. Yes, they are motivated by the kinds of urgencies this team observes. They really care about economic inequality. They really care about Palestine. But they are often strident, unstrategic, and unkind, clearly immoral. I think this team knows in their hearts that it is not necessarily good to be political, because they do a really funny trick of the light in Burdens, right? Like, they analogize being political as analogous to like saving a drowning child. But then they're like, well, you don't have to do it if you're a single mom, and you only really have to do a post every now and then, and you don't have to do it about everything. You don't have to save all the drowning children, just ones that are proximate to you and not in Croatia. I think that two things in this speech, firstly on the civic and then on the personal. On the civic, this team tries to preempt our material on the public service and so on by saying, well, it's a permissible exception to the rule that apoliticality is immoral, that some people have to be apolitical. I think this is not effective preemption because it misses our claim, which is that apoliticality is an essential civic virtue in many instances. It is clearly important to the functioning of our democracy. It cannot be immoral if it produces socially good outcomes and is for many people an active obligation. And I want to note that this argument is really useful because it illustrates that the kind of general principle this team seems to be vibing towards, which is, well, you should seek to maximize the political outcomes that we affirmative want, is not a cogent principle. It would be very wrong for me to use my role in the Department of Education to brainwash children to believe left-wing opinions, even if maybe that would further them having left-wing opinions, right? It'd be very wrong for a doctor to spend a great deal of time very stridently advertising their political opinions, even if those political opinions were right, because it would make their patients who are wrong but still important humans feel uncomfortable and feel unsafe. These things might make appealing political outcomes potentially closer in the short term, but at the absence of trust in the state, trust in institutions, and self-determination of like democratic citizens, right? And those things we believe are very important. Those things are protected by apoliticality. And I flip their things about universities choosing not to have political statuses. I take it is very good for institutions to, for instance, be resilient to the government of the day, to, for instance, protect their researchers, their students from greater political interference by being apolitical. I think in many instances this is an essential part of public life. And I know, like, you know, I think Charlie in their speech is like, well, we would say in virtually every instance you have the obligation to, you know, progress justice and progress, you know, progressivism and all that. But this point shows that you don't have that obligation in virtually every instance, right? Like me and like the 50,000 other people who work for the New South Wales Public Service don't have that obligation. It is clearly not an obligation at all. So I think that wins us the debate in one way. Let's talk about the personal now. I'll start by responding to them. They have two sets of arguments here. The first thing they say is, well, apoliticality is an active choice and politicality is very easy. There are several problems with this argument. Firstly, the actions they describe are unbelievably trivial and unimportant. You cannot be obliged to make an Instagram post. That's stupid. If that was true, like, why did you do a speech? You should have spent 6 minutes talking about Palestine. Clearly, this is not actually an obligation. So it doesn't fucking change anyone's mind. You're scrolling Instagram. It's passive consumption. And because everyone's such a ridiculous information overload, they have no real way of acting on those Instagram posts. I do not think that this is a meaningful form of political action or of politicality, to be honest. And secondly, I would note that these actions are often misdirected. For example, lazy feminist activism that just does essentialism, or people who are like pro-Houthi or something because they like, you know, get so anti-colonial they go nuts. And I would say the structural reason why this is likely is the sort of rapidity and performativity that they describe. Well, you know, you can just spend 2 minutes of your day scrolling Instagram, you can do a post and everyone will see it and be influenced to be more political, is what produces that kind of misdirected political rage that is in actual fact bad. And finally, I would note that there are important and reasonable constraints that we describe that I don't think this team grapples with properly. We tell you that it is reasonable for people to check out when time and time again they're let down by politicians. When people promise them equality,
inequality, but they never get it. When people say, well, you just need to do a post, you just need to speak out, but it never gets them anywhere, I think it's highly understandable. Maybe it's not desirable, maybe it's not perfect, but I think it is certainly permissible. Then they say, well, apoliticality achieves suboptimal outcomes or sometimes allows bad things to happen. There are a series of problems with this argument. Firstly, politicality often achieves bad outcomes, either because people have bad political ideas or because they have good political ideas that go wrong. Politics is really unpredictable. This team at various points acknowledges that, and I think it is fine for people who notice that they are not that good at politics and opt out of it. They say, well, that's because of kind of like an underlying immoral slant in your nature, and well, what are you meant to do then? But I would say, I would ask you, is it immoral if you know you'd be a bad parent to refrain from having children? Probably not, right? Like, it would be better if you'd be a good parent, but you wouldn't, and you know that about yourself, so you ought not have kids. Nice analogy. All right. Yeah, that's fine. What do we tell you on the personal? Our claims are it is often wise and humble to recognize that you are a person ill-suited towards politics, and that politics often trades off against other important virtues and pursuits, like being a generous and kind person who isn't fixated on politics. Their response is very unambitious. They're like, well, you should read, you should be curious. The problem with this is that politicality is not generic curiosity. Politics is the business of solutions. And I'm sure this team would describe someone who reads a lot of economics but never has any real leanings as someone who is being apolitical, and this team does not provide them with a meaningful path to a solution. But the second problem, I think, is that at best, this just suggests that politicality is one virtue among a constellation of virtues that are all kind of good to have, but not obligatory. Is it more virtuous to be someone who reads a lot of economics texts in the hope of one day forming an economics opinion, or someone who doesn't read any economics texts, but spends a great deal of time becoming great at painting and donates their paintings to the world and makes everyone happy in that way? Both are virtues, creativity and politicality, but I would suggest that the absence of neither is immoral.
Thank you so much to all of the speakers in the debate. I really enjoyed watching that debate, despite the defamation of sorry. But it was really good. So I think all of our speakers deserve another round of applause.